bandsaw. It has a very thin blade. They come in different widths, from about 1/8 of an inch all the way to about 6 inches wide, depending on the machine they're running on. It is a continuous band that goes around 2 big rollers, inside guards on both sides. There is an adjustment for the guard on this side. You want to keep it just above the material when you're operating, so that if you slip, your hands don't get into the blade. If you look on the guard rest itself, there's 2 fingers that come down on an angle like this. They're guides for the blade. Underneath here, there's also 2 fingers that come up, that the blade travels through these fingers, through these fingers. If you look in behind the fingers, there is a ball bearing on the top and the bottom, and that stops the blade from moving backwards as you're pushing wood through it. This machine accounts for about 90% of the people being injured in a school setting, because you're constantly working very close to the blade. People often have their finger behind the blade. The piece of wood either breaks or slips and they go into it. They don't damage themselves severely, but it does cause most of the injuries, and we want to try and avoid that. Okay, so we're not going to have our fingers behind the blade. Okay, if we're using small pieces of wood, we're going to have a piece of wood behind them so that it cuts a piece of wood if there's a problem, and not our fingers. Okay, so we're just going to bring this down just over our wood. If you're cutting straight, it's not a big deal. I can go in nice and easy. I have to go back slow so I don't pull the blade off. If I'm cutting a curved piece like this, I have to make what's called relief cuts. So I'm not twisting the blade as I'm trying to cut around the surface. So I'm going to make relief cuts into my line. I'm going to leave my line on so I can sand down to my line. And then I'm going to cut just outside of my line through my relief cuts. Now I'm going to leave my line on. Anytime you have pieces, don't reach in to grab small pieces, especially if they're near the blade, until the blade stops. Okay, so you can see I've got a nice curve there. Now I can take it over to the sander and cut the curve. If I want to cut a straight parallel piece and I don't feel comfortable on a table saw, I can put a fence on the bandsaw. Watch, you don't pinch your fingers when you put it on. I have to raise the guard up so it's just over the fence. I measure how much distance is. It's 1/2 inch. I'm going to set the fence exactly 1/2 inch from the blade to the fence. I'm going to lock it in position. Now I can have the fence on this side of the blade, or I can have the fence on this side of the blade, whatever you feel comfortable. If you have a wider piece, then you have to have it on this side of the blade. Okay? So, bring my guard down just over the material, or over the fence, sorry. Okay. Turn it on. Wait till it stops. If you don't have a fence attachment, you can clamp a piece of wood like a fence using a C-clamp or an F-clamp on either side. Just make sure it's 90 degrees to the edge of the table and parallel with the blade, and that'll work for you. On this machine, I also have the ability to use a miter gauge that goes from 90 degrees to 45 degrees either way. There is a gauge on here, I can set it. If I'm making a 90-degree cut and I want to make sure it's accurate, I can put it in upside down and lock it, because this groove is machined 90 degrees to the guides. If I'm running through with a miter saw, one hand is holding the wood back against the miter gauge, one hand is pushing it through. You're not having your hand directly in line with the blade, you're standing behind the miter gauge. Okay. Always remember to wait till it stops before you move that piece of wood. If I want to cut an angle, okay, I can set the miter gauge for exactly 45 degrees in this case. Exactly the same. I'm holding it back against the miter gauge, not getting my fingers near the blade, and I'm going to go straight through. Line it up with your mark, hold it. Cut it off. It's not as accurate as a miter saw, but it is something if you need a quick angle to do. With this machine also, this table right now is set 90 degrees to the blade. If I have an angle cut, I can loosen off the table here underneath, and I can tip this whole table all the way over to 45 degrees. And then lock it in place, and I can still use the miter gauge or the fence, so I'm running a piece through it on an angle. But most of the time it's set for 90 degrees, because that's most of the time what we use.